Welcome back to Tanya in Less Than 5. The last few days we've been reviewing Chapter 4. In Chapter 2, we established the essence of the godly soul, the divine spiritual DNA, the spark of God that exists in every Jew. This level exists, not necessarily are we conscious of it all the time, but it's there, and in later chapters we're going to talk about how we might be able to activate that to motivate us to behave. In Chapter 3, we established the godly soul's personality, its mind, its understanding of God, and its feelings of attraction and awe of God. Now, what does one do with all of these feelings to God? For that, the Alter Rebbe identifies 3 vehicles, or what he calls clothing, through which the godly soul can express its feelings for God. These 3 garments, these 3 clothings are thought, speech, and action. Thinking thoughts of Torah, speaking words of Torah, and acting, doing mitzvot, doing the divine commandments. And this is the way for the godly soul to express its love and its awe of Hashem, by thinking God's Torah and speaking of God's Torah and doing God's commandments. This is true of any feeling that anybody has toward anybody else. A person has feelings towards somebody else. That feeling is first of all experienced in my thoughts. I think about that person, how much I like that person. And then I talk to that person, express my feelings, and then I act. I might give a gift, I might give a hug, I might shake a hand. These are all modes of expressing my feelings. I take my feelings and I enclose them in one of these 3 things, thought, speech, or action, to express and to experience the feelings I have. And the same thing is true of the godly soul. It has all these feelings for God, and it encloses it into thought, speech, and action of Torah and mitzvot, the commandments. Now, from this perspective, it would seem as follows. There's the godly soul divine essence, pure. Then there's the godly soul's understanding of God. And those understandings, through the element of dat, as we discussed in the last chapter, it becomes a feeling for God. And then, because I need a way to express my feelings, it gets put into an action, or a thought, or into speech. From this perspective, it would seem that thought, speech, and action are the end of the line, and they're the lowest of all of them. Surely my feelings are much deeper than a mere act. As the saying goes in English, it's the gesture that counts. The person really wanted to do something for me, and that's what really counts. The feelings is what counts. But when it comes to Torah and mitzvahs, there's another component. These thoughts of Torah, these words of Torah, and these actions of mitzvahs, they're not mine. Those are God's commandments. Those are God's words. Those are God's ideas. This is the fulfillment of God's desire. He wants me to do this act. God and His desire and His ideas, His Torah, are all one. It's one entity, which means essentially that every time I fulfill God's desire, that act is a godly act. So as lofty as my feelings are for God, they are still my feelings. But an action for God, a mitzvah, is no longer my action. It's God's action. And when I take my feelings and I put it into an act for God, that is, as the Alter Rebbe puts it, hugging and kissing God. Speaking the words of Torah, that's like giving God a kiss. Because I'm putting all my feelings into that thought, into that speech, and into that action. Thus becoming one and embracing God Himself, and God embraces me in return through that act. The takeaway from this is 2 things. Number 1, no matter how lofty my feelings are for God, they remain my feelings, and they remain here. It doesn't go anywhere. If I take those feelings and I put it into the act of a mitzvah, into the word of Torah, into a thought of Torah, now I've expressed my feelings to God in His behaviors, in His speech, and in His thoughts. Secondly, even if I don't feel anything for God, I feel nothing. It doesn't change the fact that the act of the mitzvah I do in that moment is an embrace and a personal encounter with God, because that act or that word or that idea that I think of is God's act. It's God's desire. And therefore in that moment, I become one with Him, irrespective of how I feel. Looking forward to seeing you at the end of chapter 5.